It was September 24th, 1942. You could feel the tension in the conference room at Hitler's East Prussia headquarters. The highest-ranking German officers sat around a huge table made of oak. Their uniforms were perfect, and their faces showed nothing. At the head of the table sat Adolf Hitler. General Franz Halder, the chief of the German General Staff, stood before him, about to give a talk that would end his career. Halder had held his position since 1938. He had been there for the victories in Poland, France, and the Low Countries. He helped plan the invasions that made Germany the boss of Europe. But now, in the fall of 1942, he was about to do the worst thing you could do in Nazi Germany: tell Hitler the truth. The topic was Stalingrad. For 2 months, the Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, had been fighting street by street, building by building, in the Soviet city on the Volga River. They were only gaining ground inch by inch. Casualties were rising like crazy, and Halder had done the math. He started his speech with the facts. The Sixth Army had lost over 80,000 men since August. Soviet reinforcements were coming across the Volga every night. German supply lines were stretched so thin, running hundreds of miles across open land, that Soviet fighters were causing more and more problems. Winter was coming, and the army wasn't ready. Then, Halder said the words that would ruin him. "My leader, we can't take Stalingrad with the forces we have. The cost in men and resources will be way more than any gains. I suggest we set up our defenses, get ready for winter, and attack again in the spring when we have enough supplies and men." The room went silent. Every officer knew what Halder had just done. He had gone against Hitler. He had talked about retreating. He had suggested that the leader's plan was wrong. These were things that could end his career or even his life. Hitler's face turned red. When he spoke, his voice was quiet at first, which was even scarier than when he yelled. "You suggest we pull back? You who have watched every retreat and setback of this campaign. You who have always been careful and slow while I have won victory after victory?" Halder stood firm. This was the moment that would show what he was made of. He could back down, say he was sorry, or soften his words. Or he could tell the whole truth, knowing it would end his military career. He chose the truth. "My leader, I have studied the situation closely. The Sixth Army needs about 700 tons of supplies every day. We can maybe get 300 tons there on good days. As winter gets closer, this will get even worse. The Soviet forces in Stalingrad aren't giving up. Intelligence says they're planning a big attack, probably on our sides, which are held by Romanian and Italian troops who don't have good anti-tank weapons. If we keep all our forces in Stalingrad, we could end up with the entire Sixth Army trapped." The details of Halder's report made things worse, not better. He wasn't just saying he was worried. He was giving a detailed breakdown that went directly against Hitler's idea of an easy victory. He was using facts and figures against ideology and willpower. Hitler stood up, no longer able to control his anger. "How dare you tell me what's possible and not? I have done what everyone said was impossible. I conquered France in 6 weeks when your precious general staff said it would take years. I have brought Germany from defeat to ruling Europe." Halder tried to answer. "My leader, I'm not doubting your achievements. I'm showing you the cold, hard facts." Hitler shouted, "Facts? You always talk about facts and being careful. Wars are won by will, by determination, by refusing to lose. The Soviets are about to fall apart. Stalingrad is the key. Once it's ours, the whole Soviet position on the Volga collapses. We will control the river. We will control the oil from the Caucasus. We will win this war. But at what cost?" Halder asked, his voice getting louder without him meaning it. "Even if we take Stalingrad, which will take at least another month of this awful street fighting, we'll have an exhausted army holding a dangerous position deep in Soviet territory. Winter is coming, and our supply lines can't possibly keep up. Enough." Hitler slammed his hands on the table. "I am surrounded by people who don't believe in victory, by men who see problems instead of chances, by generals who want to retreat at the first sign of trouble. You, Halder, have been holding this army back since the beginning. You didn't want to attack France. You didn't want to invade the Soviet Union. You have been against every bold move that has led to German victory. And now, you're against Stalingrad." The accusation was partly true. Halder had worried about many of Hitler's choices, but he had also helped carry them out, often very well. The problem was that Hitler only remembered the times Halder disagreed, not the times he succeeded. In Hitler's world, Anyone who questioned him was wrong because he was never wrong. The other officers in the room shifted in their seats. Some agreed with Halder's report. Field commanders from the Eastern Front had been sending similar messages about supply lines being too long and troops being too tired. But none of them would speak up. They knew that agreeing with anyone who criticized Hitler's plan would ruin their careers. Halder made one last try. "My leader, I have served Germany faithfully, but you have become stuck in your own old ways. You are too attached to outdated ideas. You have not served the vision that Germany needs. I need generals who believe in victory, not number crunchers who worry about costs." Hitler turned to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, his most loyal follower. Halder is fired from his job as Chief of the General Staff, effective right away. He will be replaced by General Kurt Zeitzler. Maybe a younger officer with experience on the Eastern Front will have the aggressive spirit this job needs. Halder took the symbols of his rank off his collar and put them on the table. He had known this was coming since he decided to speak honestly. He gave a formal salute and left the room. His military career was over. He would spend the rest of the war in forced retirement. He was later arrested after the July 1944 plot to kill Hitler, even though he wasn't directly involved. But as he walked out, Halder knew he had been right. Every calculation he had made, every worry he had voiced, was correct. In the next 4 months, he would be proven right in a terrible way. The very attack he had predicted happened exactly 8 weeks later. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces hit the Romanian positions north and south of Stalingrad, just as Halder had warned. The Romanians, with weak anti-tank weapons and thin defenses, fell apart in hours. By November 23, the entire German Sixth Army was trapped. Over 280,000 men stuck in the city that Hitler had insisted must be taken at all costs. The supply problems that Halder had calculated so accurately happened exactly as he had said. The Luftwaffe tried to supply the trapped army by air, but they never even came close to the 700 tons needed each day. Most days they delivered 100 tons or less. Soldiers starved. Equipment broke down because there was no fuel or parts. Medical supplies ran out. Men froze to death in inadequate winter clothing. The Sixth Army commanders trapped in the pocket sent desperate messages asking for permission to break out while they still could. Hitler refused, remembering Halder's advice about retreating. He was determined to show that willpower could beat logistics. The army would hold Stalingrad. Relief forces would break through. The situation would get better through determination and fighting spirit. But determination can't create food when there is none. Willpower can't make ammunition. Fighting spirit can't warm frozen soldiers or heal wounded men without medicine. The math that Halder had presented was unavoidable. By December, the Sixth Army was no longer able to fight well. By January, soldiers were dying of starvation. On February 2, 1943, the survivors surrendered. Of the 280,000 men trapped, about 91,000 survived to surrender. Most would die in Soviet prison camps. Only about 6,000 ever returned to Germany. Halder watched all of this from his forced retirement. He kept detailed journals that would later become important historical records. He wrote about how frustrated he was that he had been right, but treated as wrong. He wrote about how his predictions had come true in precise ways. He thought about the main thing that had destroyed him and would ultimately destroy Germany. The problem was that Hitler had made a system where the truth was whatever he decided it was. Facts that went against his vision were called defeatism. Officers who gave correct reports were accused of not having enough fighting spirit. The demand to tell Hitler only what he wanted to hear, instead of the honest truth he needed to know, had warped the military command structure. General Halder tried to stand apart, sticking to professional military standards with honest assessments and realistic strategies. But in Hitler's Germany, being good at your job took a back seat to blind loyalty. It was safer to be wrong and loyal than right and critical. The yes men thrived. Those who dared speak the truth were cast aside. General Kurt Zeitzler replaced Halder. At first, he seemed more aggressive and hopeful, which pleased Hitler. But before long, Zeitzler started voicing the same worries about Stalingrad that Halder had. But by then, it was too late for the army. Zeitzler's honesty, though belated, only served to document the disaster about to happen rather than prevent it. Hitler reacted to Zeitzler as he had to Halder. He brushed aside the concerns, accused Zeitzler of being a defeatist, and insisted that Schierwell would win out. Zeitler lasted longer than Halder, but he too was eventually dismissed after repeatedly asking for permission to retreat, a move that might have saved many German soldiers. He ended up suffering a nervous breakdown in 1944 and was removed from his post. This pattern played out again and again during the war. Competent generals who told Hitler what he didn't want to hear were fired. Those who flattered him and told him what he wanted to hear were rewarded with promotions. As a result, German military actions became more and more detached from what was actually happening on the ground. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's best generals, was more successful than most at navigating this tricky situation. He would present realistic evaluations, but frame them in a way that didn't directly challenge Hitler. He would ask for flexible defense strategies instead of suggesting retreats. He would emphasize strategic repositioning rather than full-scale withdrawals. These word games sometimes worked, but it also meant that even Germany's top military minds had to waste time managing Hitler's ego instead of focusing on the war. The tragedy of Halder's firing wasn't just the waste of a capable officer. It sent a clear message through the ranks. Telling Hitler the truth is more dangerous than losing battles. This created an atmosphere where officers at all levels learned to twist or hide any data that might anger Hitler. Intelligence reports were watered down. Figures on casualties were made to look better. The enemy's strength was played down. Issues with supplies were minimized. This constant distortion of information went up the chain of command, meaning Hitler's choices were based on increasingly made-up ideas about what was really going on. He was making big decisions based on what his people thought he wanted to hear, rather than the facts. This gap between reality and what Hitler believed grew as the war went on. It led to terrible decisions in 1943, 1944, and 1945. The Battle of Stalingrad became a symbol of all this mess. Hitler insisted the city had to be taken because he needed it for political and emotional reasons. Halder had argued that it couldn't be taken, or at least not without unacceptable losses, because the supply lines simply couldn't support it. Halder was fired for his honest assessment. And then, reality proved Halder right in the worst possible way. But even after Stalingrad, Hitler didn't learn anything. He didn't see that firing people for telling the truth was a bad idea. Instead, he became even more stubborn. He decided that the defeats must have been the fault of incompetent or traitorous generals. His answer was to take more personal control, rely even less on expert advice from the military, and trust his own gut feelings over professional knowledge. This went on until the end of the war. In 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, Hitler wouldn't release tank reserves because he was sure the landing was a diversion and the real invasion would be at Ka. His generals knew better but had learned not to argue with him too strongly. By the time Hitler realized that Normandy was the main attack, it was too late to do anything about it. In 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Hitler was still moving imaginary divisions around on maps, giving orders to armies that no longer existed, and planning counteroffensives with resources that had been used up months before. His staff knew the situation was hopeless, but kept carrying out these pointless orders because they'd learned that telling the truth was punished, while just following orders, even if they failed, was considered unfortunate. Halder survived the war. The Americans arrested him and later used him as a consultant for researching German military operations. He gave detailed accounts of the messed-up relationship between Hitler and the general staff. He explained how professional planning had been pushed aside for wishful thinking. He showed exactly how Hitler's refusal to face reality had led to strategic disasters. Halder later wrote about his firing with mixed feelings. On one hand, being right was little comfort when so many lives had been wasted. On the other hand, he had kept his integrity when it would have been easier and safer to go along with the delusion. He had told the truth when it was dangerous, and he'd paid the price for it. The lesson of Halder's firing goes beyond just military history. It shows what happens when organizations value loyalty more than being good at their jobs. When criticism is seen as betrayal, when leaders surround themselves with people who only say yes instead of experts who are willing to give bad news. This pattern can happen in many places and at different times in history. Leaders who punish those who tell the truth create systems where the truth becomes rare. People learn to tell leaders what they want to hear instead of what they need to know. Choices are made based on comforting lies rather than tough facts. And eventually, Reality comes crashing down in ways that could have been avoided if someone had been willing to listen to the Halders of the world. September 24th, 1942, was the day Hitler fired his best general for telling the truth about Stalingrad. It was also the day Hitler made sure that Stalingrad would become the disaster Halder had predicted. By getting rid of the one person willing to be honest, Hitler made sure that nobody else would dare to speak up. The truth about Stalingrad became something people couldn't talk about, and that truth led to terrible tragedy. Franz Halder lived until 1972. He saw Germany rebuild itself, the military's reputation somewhat restored, and historians acknowledge that he had been right about Stalingrad. But he also lived long enough to know that being right didn't matter as much as being believed, and that telling the truth had cost him everything, while lying had cost Germany even more. The firing of Franz Halder wasn't just a decision about one person. It was a choice between reality and fantasy, between professional skill and blind belief, between honest analysis and comfortable delusion. Hitler made the wrong choice, and 280,000 men at Stalingrad paid the price.